Hello, this is the intro to Lab 8. You'll be doing raster analysis next week. A really important topic and very useful one. You'll remember from earlier on in the quarter that raster data is useful for a number of different things, namely continuous data that ranges um, widely between two sets of numbers. Perhaps something between 0 and 200 doesn't fit neatly into a couple boxes. But you'll also learn today how to classify that and use it in many different ways. So let's just start out. So firstly, in the lab, you'll be working with the same set of data that you worked with for analyzing snail habitat a few labs ago, but this time you'll be just doing it with the raster data. So the first thing that you want to do with raster data is make sure that your environment settings are correct. And this does a couple things. So first on here, you'll note that the first thing it has you do is set your current and Scratch workspace to the right geodatabase. That just makes sure that all of the outputs from your tools will automatically be saved into the right spot. You'll still need to name them, but they'll be saved in the right spot. You also need to set the processing extent with raster data. That's important because when you run your raster analysis, it ensures that the tool that you're running is operating only within the specified coordinates. That way you're not processing a much larger area. Usually it's a larger area, not a smaller one, and then getting a whole bunch of null or no data values. You want it clipped every time to a nice, the proper extent. And the way you do that is just by setting it to a certain layer that's usually a certain layer that exists within the data, and that might be, in this case, the layer elevation. That's your kind of the grid that you're operating within. All right. So the first thing you'll be doing is reclassifying data. So this data, let's say, is continuous, and it runs between 0 and 1600, the first one, elevation. And you put that into a couple classes, 0 to 1200, 1200 to 1600, 1600 to 2000 feet, and then there are no data values. That's just where they've already perhaps gotten rid of the data that is above 2000. So you will classify that such that you only want the values in between 1200 and 1600 because that's where the snails like to live, right? So you'll reclassify the data, and then the output value that you get will have zeros in all of the elevation values except between 1200 and 1600 where it will be 1. That's one of the first things you'll do, and then you'll do that with a number of these different data sets: elevation, the forest, the geology, and then you'll get your output as the snail habitat. Another important thing to point out is when you look at a table for raster values, you will see that the rows of the data are for what the value is, and then the number of cells that have that value. So in this case, let's say there are 4 different values possible. Value of 1 is, there are many cells of that, 147,840. The value 4, there are 97,386. All right. Another cool thing you can do, so remember we used union and intersect tools to sort of get the areas where perhaps the slope was steep and it was weak soil. Those are vulnerable to landslides. Well, we can do something similar with this. It's called a raster calculator, it's a Boolean overlay. And this pretty much means you multiply the 2 different rasters that you want, and then the output is where both of those are true. Or in this case, all 3 of our data sets. So we want that elevation range, we want the limestone habitat, and then we want the tree habitat. So very dense forest between elevations 1200 and 1600, and that occurs on limestone soil. We multiply all 3 of those together using the raster calculator, and then we get this output in purple. Another thing that you can do, again very useful, is to rank that. And you can rank it simply by pretty much using the raster calculator to add it together. And then the output, instead of only getting the habitat where that all intersects in one spot, you will get all of the data will essentially be retained, and then the output will show, okay, this is where all three are true, this is where two are true, one is true, and where none of it is true. So in this case, the darkest green on this map shows where the best snail habitat is. Number 2 is the next best. Number 1 is the next best. 0 is not habitat. And this has a lot of different applications. You can imagine you don't want just the best, but you might also want to know, okay, well, what could be good habitat? They might also be found in these areas, and what can serve perhaps as a corridor between patches. Another thing that you'll do as part of this analysis is calculate the distance to roads. So this raster calculator does that here on the left. You can see areas that are very close to the roads are bright yellow, and then it gets into the orange, pink, and then purple farther away from the roads. You can also do a buffer. This should look really similar to what you did a few labs ago with the vector data. Create a buffer around those roads, but in this case, it's a raster. So you will create a layer here, a raster layer that pretty much shows how far in the habitat it is away from the roads. So this one is a little bit reversed. The green is the best habitat that's the farthest away from a road, and then the red is what's closest. So this pretty much further shrinks down that snail habitat, adding kind of another layer of complexity as to what really is best, because snails would get crushed if they're close to the road. So the snails will do best in habitat that's far away from that. So the green in this case could be thought of as the best, ranking number 4, and then the worst, ranking number 1, is that red. Okay, so moving on from that example, now we'll be looking at a couple other different examples. So you might want to identify an area where you could put a winter ski cabin. She discusses it right here, topographic functions with rasters. Very, very useful, right? This is a very common thing you will do using raster data because it's continuous. Elevation does not sit between certain classes. It's not discrete. It's everywhere. So usually elevation will be described using rasters or a TIN, which is a vector data model that's kind of like a raster. So she will have you calculate areas of low slope and sunny areas. So here's the slope tool. Your input raster is the original elevation layer. The output raster will be called slope, and then output in degrees. So pretty much this one will calculate out of the elevation what the slope is, and then you also will calculate aspect. So here's the slope tool on the left, and on the right is the aspect. And the aspect is the direction that the slope faces. So you want it to be a generally flat area. You don't want to put the cabin on a really steep slope. You want to put it on a flat area and an area that faces the sun. So here on the right is showing the output from the aspect. And so the aspect, what areas are going to be sunny? Well, those will be the slopes that face south. So you want a generally more level or gentle slope that faces south. Cool. So here's another thing that you'll do in that lab. You will run the majority filter tool. So these aren't actually a great fair comparison because the one on the right is a more zoomed in than the one on the left. But nevertheless, you can see the one on the left is sort of very granular. It's a very high resolution, and the raster makes it look sort of choppy. What you can do is run it through the majority filter tool a couple times, and what that does is pretty much smooths out the lines such that it looks almost like it's a vector data, almost looks like it's polygons, but it's not. It's still raster. The cell sizes are still similar, but it just smooths out those boundaries. Obviously, that's really nice for map making, and it will make those, it will be easier to convert it into a vector data set because, depending on what you're doing with the vector data set, it might actually follow the edges of the raster cells and make it look like a series of steps, like a staircase along your polygon boundaries. You don't want that. You want it nice and smooth. So this, running it through majority filter, smoothing out the lines between classes, will make it convert into a better vector data set. There are some downsides to that. Keep in mind, she'll point them out to you. One of them is that it changes the data, right? So the raster data is already a little bit of a degraded version of reality because some things are discrete. There's a fine line between exactly what is lake and what is not a lake. So those lines can become a little bit blurred, and the data can be degraded when you're running it through majority filter tool. So just keep that in mind. Another really basic thing that she'll have you run through at the end of the lab, it's unfortunate that it's not at the beginning because it's very basic, but at the end of the lab is to have you set areas where there is no data to no data, such that you don't want everything to always be zeros and ones, right? You might want a raster where the data literally only exists within that area. So you can see by this example, there are all of these polygons, and that is where the data is that we want. We can pretty much ignore everything else within our grid, within this rectangle. But the way that we ran it through the tool, there are zeros and ones. Well, 0 is still data. So we want to enter no data value for zeros. That way we only get ones out of it. So that's one thing that she'll have you do. Another thing that will be very familiar to you because you went through the GPS lab with lab 4 is running an interpolation. And this is using climate station data, which exist at discrete points, to calculate over a continuous surface what the precipitation is. So there are different methods that we use, and in this case you'll use IDW, inverse distance weighting. It's one of the simpler, a little bit less reliable scientifically versions of interpolation. You used what's called kriging, that should sound familiar to kriging, to interpolate the soil data in lab 4. So anyway, you'll run IDW based off of these climate stations, which are the purple triangles, to calculate the precipitation across this entire surface, this large watershed which has all of these sub-watersheds within it. So you can already see just by looking at it, there are very few climate stations here, and it's interpolating across this surface using those climate stations. And that data might not be super reliable. I mean, there are only actually climate stations within a few of these watersheds. So that right there should just be a little bit of a red flag to you that the data within here might not be super reliable unless it was recorded there. Take everything with a grain of salt. So from there, you will get to do a cool thing. So you will interpolate so that you get that nice precipitation raster. You know what the precipitation is across all of those watersheds. And then you will use the zonal statistics tool to essentially add all of the values of the cells within each watershed together to calculate what the precipitation will be. She gives you the formulas for that, the conversion between precipitation and then total volume per year. And then you'll end up getting this raster here on the right that shows how much precipitation falls in each watershed. There's quite a range. So again, take that with a grain of salt. Over this small area, how can we have some watersheds that get 5 times as much rain as the others? But again, this is by total volume, so some watersheds are bigger than others. So the last thing that you'll do in the lab is, of course, one of the practice exercises. This one is very, very simple, straightforward. This lab is also very short, so keep that in mind. It'll take you about half the time as the other labs. And all you really have to do here is create this Boolean, do a Boolean operation. Very, very similar to the snail habitat work that you did earlier in the lab. Right here, she'll tell you where the vegetation density is high, so you have to pull that out, and then where the land is also owned by the Forest Service. So you'll have to pull that out of a raster that has different landowner categories. That's really all there is to it. So have fun and stay happy.